started, my primary role is to welcome everyone here on behalf of all of the deans and deanlets and faculty of the College of Criminal Justice, and hope that you enjoy this presentation. Also, I need to remind you to turn off all of your cell phones, electronic devices, beepers, and buzzers. This being a courtroom, there's a special device here so that if your phone goes off, you will be zapped with a spray of water. And so be careful, make sure all of your devices are off. Also, I'm going to ask that you hold all of your questions that you will have, I'm sure, until the end of today's presentation, unless the speakers override this request. Also, for those of you who have been in attendance before, we now have a walk-around microphone. So I will, as soon as I finish this presentation, I will transform into Phil Donahue. And after the formal lecture, when the question and answer section comes up, I will wander around with the mic and give you an opportunity. That way, for those of you who haven't seen this before, your questions are actually recorded on the video that is also made available. Because sometimes, if you go to the Beto Chair Lecture Series video link, you find at the end of the session, sometimes the speaker is answering questions that we don't know what the questions were because the mics weren't collectively set up to pick up the audio. So that problem should be mitigated today, so we should be able to get everything on board. Also, I want to remind the doctoral students that immediately following the formal lecture, you are invited to join Drs. Gabbidon and Unnever for an informal colloquium in the Texas room that will be followed by lunch. I'm not sure how the lunch is going to work, I'm hoping that we will eat in C Java, so rather than having to haul your food back to the Texas room, we'll all eat there before we transport our guests back to the airport. And so when we say doctoral students are invited, you know what that means. That's code word. Sign the list so you get the credit for it. Also, in the meal process, sign the list so that somebody else pays for it, you don't get hunted down. This is the second Beto Chair lecture being presented for this academic year. It'll be followed by a lecture by Dr. Jack Green from Northeastern University that's going to be held on February 17th. Again, that's a Friday at 9:30, so put that on your calendars. The committee is actively working to locate one more lecturer for the spring series, and you will be advised when we do finalize that decision. Also, I need to acknowledge formally the Jesse H. Jones and Mary Gibbs Jones Endowment Corporation, also known as the Houston Endowment, for giving us the gift that is used to help underwrite this particular lecture series. The purpose of that gift was to help enrich the educational experiences of the College of Criminal Justice's doctoral students by bringing leading figures in our discipline to campus. It was named after Dr. George J. Beto, former director of the Texas Department of Corrections and a distinguished professor of criminal justice here at Sam Houston State University from 1972 until his retirement in 1992. And so we are particularly grateful for the Houston Endowment for allowing us to develop this series. And that's why all of my attention as the chair of this committee is really directed toward the doctoral students. And so those of you who are not doctoral students, you have aspirations to move toward. So hopefully you'll be one of the people that I'm welcoming, especially welcoming this series. And now I'm going to turn this over and I'm going to ask Dr. Bill Oliver to introduce our speakers.
Good morning. For the Beto lecture, I asked Dennis to bring in Dr. James Unnever. Lo and behold, as one of the leading scholars in the field, lo and behold, I ended up getting 2 leading scholars in the field. So I need to keep this up and keep this going. I want to take a moment, though, to kind of deviate from the introduction to kind of say a thank you in an indirect way. Hopefully, at some point in your life, you've had somebody that's influenced you, guided you, given you some direction, acted as a mentor. And I'm not talking about the kind of mentor from a program that you're kind of forced into, or really even so much as just kind of guiding you and telling you what to do or how to do it, but somebody that actually challenges you, forces you to think, to move beyond, dig down deep, pull things out that you never thought you'd be able to do. And then, once you've done that, to push you even further. Hopefully, since this is geared toward a lot of the PhD students and graduate students, somewhere within these halls you'll find one of those mentors. And that somewhere down the road, after you kind of learn from them, and pushed by them, move on into the field, become a professor yourself, ideally, that you'll thank them, that you'll have that opportunity to stay in touch. Rare will it become the opportunity that you'll have to actually become their colleague and to eventually become your friend. And that's a great experience if you have that opportunity. Make sure though down the road that you do take that opportunity to thank them. Even rarer is it ever going to be that you'll be able to stand in front of your peers, your colleagues, as well as your students, to be able to thank them in public. And even rarer still is going to be that opportunity to acknowledge all that they've done for you as a mentor. So I want to take this time to thank Dr. James Unnever, who was my mentor at Akers University. So on to the formal introduction. Dr. James Unnever is currently Associate Professor of Criminology at the University of South Florida, Sarasota, Manatee, and for many years was Professor of Sociology at Radford University, Virginia, which is where I first met him, had that first class, and had to endure him. I survived him. He's the author of over 40 publications appearing in the top journals, and I do mean top journals in sociology, criminology, and criminal justice, including Social Forces, Social Problems, Criminology, Journal of Research in Crime and Delinquency, Theoretical Criminology, Journal of Criminal Justice, Justice Quarterly. He was most recently the recipient of the Donald A.J. McNamara Award from the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences for the most outstanding journal article of the year. And he was named one of the top most innovative authors in criminology for the first decade of the 21st century. Dr. Shaun L. Gabbidon is a distinguished professor of criminal justice in the School of Public Affairs at Penn State in Harrisburg. He also has served as the fellow at Harvard University, W.E.B. Du Bois Institute for Afro-American Research, and is an adjunct faculty member in the Center for African Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. He is the author of over 50 peer-reviewed journal articles appearing in criminal justice journals, ranging from the Journal of Criminal Justice Education and Justice Quarterly to the Journal of Criminal Justice and Criminal Justice and Behavior. Dr. Gabbidon also serves as the editor of the Sage Journal, Race and Justice, and he is most recently the recipient, and probably rightly so, of the 2009 W.E.B. Du Bois Award from the Western Society of Criminology for his contribution in the area of race, ethnicity, and justice. Jim and Shaun are our co-authors on the just recently published A Theory of African American Offending. And ultimately, this groundbreaking book is the reason that they're here and what they'll be presenting on today. I would say that this is probably going to be a definitive theory book probably for decades to come. And I would believe that PhD students and graduate students will be able to utilize this book to test in numerous hypotheses within their theory. And they lay out the hypotheses for you. All you got to do is go out and find some data and test it. The really savvy PhD student, I think, can make a career off of this one book. So if you're interested, here they are. The book will keep, along with the numerous hypotheses to be tested, illuminate all of this. This is the presentation that they'll be giving today on the theory of African American offending. So please join me in welcoming Dr. James Unnever and Dr. Shaun Gabbidon.
First of all, we'd like to thank the college for having us. It's an honor to be here at Sam Houston State University. What we're going to do is we're going to do a tag team here. And since we believe in equality, we're going to split the PowerPoints in half, okay, equally. I'm going to start off just giving you some background on the book and some of the initial parts of our arguments. And Jim is going to take the second half of our argument. One of the things that most people will probably wonder is how did we connect on this project? We've done quite a bit of research on race and crime in general, and in some ways, I think Jim would probably agree, we've danced around this topic a little bit in terms of this theoretical, putting together a theory in this area. But individually, Jim has embarked on research on public opinion, crime and justice topics. Many people know of his tests of various criminological theories that relate to race. I have done, as a graduate student, one of the things that I always remember is that we would have assignments for doctoral classes, and in doing those assignments, I always wondered what blacks had to say about crime. So normally the first part of the evening I would do the assignment, and then the second part of the evening I'd be reading on what black scholars had to say about these particular topics. I've also written books on race and crime, reviewed in numerous theories that have looked at this question of race and racial differences in offending. And recently I've done quite a few projects related to public opinion in crime, which connects with some of Jim's interests. We connected in 2009. Actually, what happened was I had Penn State purchased a data set for me that I saw some measures that I thought would be interesting. And I contacted George Higgins, a scholar at the University of Louisville, to see if he wanted to work on this project. And in doing the project, I don't know if some of you have had this experience, sometimes you're doing the project and for some reason, something just isn't right. Is there something more you can get out of that data? And sometimes you have to look beyond yourselves to get that. Well, I had been reading and admiring Jim's work for some time, so I do what I normally do when I run into these problems. I either pick up the phone or I go to a conference and just talk to somebody and say, hey, are you interested? And I've done this well in the sense that I've picked very good collaborators. Helen Taylor Greene, I met her at a conference and we collaborated wonderfully. Same thing with Jim. So I have a knack for picking good people to collaborate with. Well, anyway, Jim came on board with the project, and it essentially turned into a JQ article that was published early this year. But during the process, Jim mentioned that he had an idea for a book. He knew how I was editing some book series, and he said, hey, this is, I have this idea of putting together some public opinion papers I have and turning them into a book. So we met at the meeting for dinner, and that meeting turned into a 3-hour plus discussion, somewhat about the book, but also about theory and the lack of theory related to African American, or a sort of coherent theoretical statement. Many people have said many things about this particular topic. So really, by the end of the evening, I had steered him away from that idea and said, hey, what do you think about doing a book on African American offending? Well, we both knew it was needed. We both knew it was long overdue. We both felt that it was something that we had to do. So we left the meeting, we exchanged emails, and we had 3-hour conversations on the phone about the book, about our ideas. And we basically said, let's, he's not going to do that other book. We're going to do this book in African American offending. But shortly thereafter, this book came out, Justice in America: The Separate Realities of Blacks and Whites. The exact same book that Jim was going to write. So I gave him good advice there. All right, so we had to start out with this theory with some points that we agreed on. And we had these ideas. We mutually agreed that any theory aimed at explaining African American offending must consider the unique worldview that is tied to the African American experience. We believe African Americans essentially have what we call a peerless experience. And that had to be a part of the theory. We also felt black scholarship must be incorporated because black scholars in many cases have unique insights that others may not have on the particular topic. And we also talked about Du Bois's early work that is so sorely neglected in the discipline as being the starting point for our ideas on race and crime. It is very unfortunate that many doctoral programs in the country in criminology don't even touch this book, because it is a seminal work that has so many criminological insights. But I'll save that for another lecture. The theory had to be multidisciplinary to formulate a holistic theory. So that means that that's what our discipline is about. We have to look at some other areas. So we looked at the psychological literature. We looked at the sociological literature. We looked at what criminology had to offer. And we looked at Afrocentric literature. And also literature beyond that. We felt it was important to cover all of our bases, because certainly not any one of these independent disciplines can can answer this question. The theory had to also explain not only why African Americans offend, because that's usually the question. Why are they offending? You know, people talk about this. But we also knew that the question should be why the majority of African Americans do not offend, because that is the case. Most of them do not ever offend or get involved in the criminal justice system. And again, as I noted earlier, I mean, we just believe that African American experience is peerless, and we had to consider that in our work. So what is the concern? Well, the concern in terms of trying to formulate a theory of African American offending is that when you look at the numbers, and these are 2008 numbers, but if you look at the 2010 numbers and the 2011 numbers, you'll see similar figures. 13% of the population account for 28% of arrests. And we also understand the limitations of arrest data. But having said that, we're going to still look at some of these numbers that help at least provide us some estimate of what's going on in terms of crime. Blacks account for 56.7% of the arrests for robbery and about 50% of those arrests for homicide. 6% of the population essentially is responsible for half of the homicides and robberies in the United States. And these figures are the same. There's no need to go through the exact numbers for women and juveniles. And the incarceration numbers here in Texas, you know this, are equally of concern to us. We admittedly suggest that there are excellent books on race and crime out there. But if you note, many of those books spend a lot of time talking about the system, and they don't necessarily explain why people end up in the system. So 20 years ago, some of us who were reading back then, or thereabouts, Catherine Russell talked about this notion of black criminology, that black criminology would be a subfield of criminology that would focus on explaining African American offending, taking into account the unique experiences of African Americans. And while some research has been done that may be classified as black criminology, the call has largely fallen on deaf ears in terms of coming up with a theory that pertains to African Americans. In fact, if many people read Du Bois's work, they would suggest that he had the first offering of black criminology in his work, The Philadelphia Negro, where he actually lived in Philadelphia for more than a year, and it is considered, his work is considered one of the preeminent early urban ethnographies in the social sciences, where he actually studied the lived experiences of blacks in Philadelphia's 7th Ward. He talked about the complex connection between race and discrimination. He gets both into criminal justice issues and into theoretical issues in that book. But he also, as you read his book, talks about how racial subordination is related to African American offending. Well, since Du Bois has written, many people have offered basically what we would call general theories that basically say that their theories can explain the disproportionate offending among blacks. They assert to be race neutral. It basically doesn't matter if you're African American, Native American, white, Hispanic, that their theory can explain all of these, the offending among all of these groups. They simply say the reason why blacks disproportionately engage in crime is because they disproportionately are exposed to the crime-causing forces highlighted by each of the theories. We know some of these theories, and we'll talk about them in a second. Social disorganization and others, a full menu of theories. But here, let's look at them a little bit and what they have to say. Social disorganization, concentric zone theory, collective efficacy, all of these concepts are reasonable, they make sense. But how does a theory such as social disorganization incorporate the everyday lived experiences that are unique to African Americans? For example, what about Hershey's social control theory? Jim and I would probably both agree that Hershey is somewhat schizophrenic on the topic of race. I mean, he talks about it, but then he comes back and says that race doesn't matter. We agree with him in terms of, the bonds and their important attachment, commitment, belief, and involvement. But in his book, he goes through a big discussion about how race matters. And then there's that quote, and where he just basically says, there's no reason to believe, if I get it right, there's no reason to believe that race matters in offending. But anyway, then he comes back with Gottfredson and has a general theory of crime. And they say self-control is the core concept. When we talk about the self-control theory, those who lack self-control tend to be impulsive, insensitive, and all these other things. But they explain offending among blacks by basically saying blacks commit more crimes because they have less self-control due to lower levels of direct supervision by family. So they talk about it, but then they come back to their theory and say, okay, well, our theory explains that as well. We do agree that self-control is an important concept, but we argue that African Americans act impulsively because at times their racial subordination exhausts their emotional capital, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Strain theories. I like Merton's strain theory because Merton is honest, okay? One thing most people don't know, Robert K. Merton is also known as Meyer Robert Skolznick, okay? And basically, he was Jewish, and he gave up his Jewish identity for a couple of reasons. Some people say he did it because he wanted to be a showman and he wanted a show name. But if you read some of the biographies of him out there, he ran away from his Jewishness because he knew that it would be difficult for him at that time to get into some of the schools that he got into, to really go where he wanted to go. And in doing that, it's interesting in his theory, he understands what blacks had to deal with. And he has a quote in his article about this. But let's just quickly talk about his theory. He talks about the disjunction between culturally defined goals in terms of financial success and institutionally accepted means, education and work. And when citizens are unable to achieve goals, they adapt in criminal ways. And his modes of adaptation, he has two that particularly relate to crime, being innovators and being retreaters. If you read his article, and most doctoral students, I'm sure, read footnotes, right? Okay. There is a footnote there that says certain elements of the Negro population have assimilated the dominant caste values of pecuniary success and advancement, but they recognize that social ascent, so moving up, is at present restricted to their own caste almost exclusively. So they can only go so far, and that can only happen within their group. The pressures upon the Negro, which would otherwise derive from the structural inconsistencies we have noticed, are hence not identical to those upon lower class whites. So he recognizes there's a difference, and I would suggest that probably has something to do with his own situation to some extent. He understood the limits that were placed on him, and he looked at African Americans and saw something familiar. General strain theory. Agnew, we know, expanded the notion of strains and stressors. He talks about the removal of positive stimuli, death of a parent, loss of friends, etc. The presentation of negative stimuli, child abuse, negative relations with parents. He also talks about racial discrimination, and in more recent years has devoted articles to talking about racial discrimination and how that also serves as a strain. Criminal victimization and other things as well. Agnew argues that there are no universal strains. Every group has their own objective strains, and that these strains can be determined post hoc. Our theory is a group-based theory that a priori articulates the strains that pervade the lived experiences of African Americans and how they relate to their offending. Our theory begins with the assumption that African Americans have a unique and collectively shared worldview. Social learning theory. Ron Akers formulated a theory in the 1960s, and basically the theory, as we know, is sort of derived from Sutherland's differential association theory. And Akers talks about the motives and drives for engaging in crime are learned in intimate personal groups, again, echoing what Sutherland had to say, and people offend when they inculcate an excess of definitions favorable to the violation of law over definitions unfavorable to law violation. Now, in that piece, when Akers and Burgess articulate the theory, they do talk about blacks. And that's one of the interesting things. A lot of theories, people don't realize, they do talk about race in some of these theories, but you really have to see what they're saying. And in this particular theory, they suggest that crime among inner city blacks results from their overexposure to others who offend in the absence of being rewarded when they engage in conventional behaviors. We agree that African Americans are more likely to offend if they associate with delinquent peers, which again relates somewhat to what Harsha has to say. But we argue that, again, this theory fails to incorporate the everyday lived experiences of blacks. Here's another neglected approach in the discipline. Most people will go through a PhD program, they'll talk about theory, but they'll never encounter Afrocentric ideas on criminality. And basically, Molefi, Kete, Asante talks about Afrocentricity and the Eurocentric ideas are privileged in the social sciences, that basically there's a marginalization of the history, contributions, and worldview of people of African descent. So then most of the theories are then formulated based upon Eurocentric ideas. One criminologist that has taken the lead on this for many years is William Oliver at Indiana University, who has talked about Afrocentricity and argues that African American offending is caused by the dysfunctional adaptations of blacks that blacks make to a Eurocentric culture, and that African American crime will decrease when blacks reject Eurocentric values and adopt an Afrocentric worldview. And he has a few articles where he talks about this process. We build upon this. And there's an assumption made by Afrocentrists that in understanding black offending can only be attained if their behavior is situated within the lived experiences of being African American in what we consider a conflicted, racially stratified society. So then, the core premise of our theory is that African Americans have a unique worldview. You keep hearing this over and over because this begins our theory. And later, when we present a schematic representation of our theory, you'll see it at the top. The worldview has been shaped by racial dynamics outside of their control. A core belief is that this worldview is that of race, and racism does matter. The worldview emerges from their collective memory and informs their everyday experiences. So that means that maybe they haven't experienced it, but maybe they've had somebody in their family experience something. So that becomes the collective memory that shapes their worldview. The worldview provides a minority of blacks with the impetus to respond to racial subordination with attitudes and behaviors that increase the likelihood of offending. However, as we were looking through this, we said it also serves as inspiration for most African Americans to resist their racial subordination, because as we said earlier, it is only a minority of African Americans who actually offend. Now, in terms of this unique worldview, how can we show that it exists? Because we keep talking about it. Well, one way to do that is actually to go through the public opinion literature. So yes, public opinion does matter. Here we have some quick statistics from some public opinion polls that have been done, and there are many more out there. Those of us who work in public opinion know the literature is just replete with the studies that show this. Hurricane Katrina. Poll suggested that 77% of blacks and 17% of whites felt the response would have been faster if the storm's victims had been white. Educational opportunities. 80% of whites and 49% of blacks believe that African American and white children have the same educational opportunities. When we get to reparations, the gulf is so wide, it's almost 100% difference here. 94% of blacks and 6% of whites support reparations. Now, if you move on to the criminal justice system, again, the numbers are the same in terms of the differences. The death penalty, 34% difference in the level of support between blacks and whites, and that has existed for the last 30 years. That hasn't really gone anywhere. In terms of the police, 44.5% of African Americans believe that racist police practices were very common. Only 10% of the whites believe that. 81.6% of African Americans believe racial profiling by the police is widespread. Only 60% of whites. In terms of the courts, recent study found 67% of blacks report that a big reason why African Americans are overrepresented in prisons is that the courts are more likely to convict blacks, and that's only 28% of whites. In terms of sentencing, 23% of whites compared to 45% of blacks strongly disapproved of more severe crack penalties. So as you can see, even at the various parts of the system, you see differences in terms of how people perceive the criminal justice system by race. And the Pew Research, who've done quite a bit of wonderful studies, also examined this question, and they show that race and racism matter. 2/3 of blacks say they are almost always or frequently discriminated against when applying for a job. 65% report discrimination when buying or renting an apartment, and 50% report discrimination when dining at restaurants or shopping in the stores. And some of my recent research on racial profile in retail settings supports all of this stuff related to shopping and dining. So why do the views of whites and blacks differ? And it's simple. History coupled with everyday experiences that you encounter that other people don't experience shapes that worldview. Okay, at this point, I think it's halfway. It's a tag team here.
Tag
You're
team.
next. There you go.
WWF. So what we believe, let me just summarize right now, that our basic argument is that African Americans have a unique worldview. And within that worldview, there are potential criminogenic forces that actually foster the 6% committing 60% of the robberies in the United States. But at the same time, that worldview also is teaches or is part of the resilience that African Americans have been able to overcome the racial subordination. But the critical question we're asking is, why does 6%, essentially black men, account for 60% of the robberies in the United States? That's the core statistic that informs the entire book. To me, it's incredulous, and we need to explain that. So that one of the core, what we believe is one of the core beliefs in the worldview that is nearly universally shared by all African Americans is that they all believe that there are and have or know of instances of criminal justice injustices. Essentially, the criminal justice system acting in a discriminatory manner towards them. And this is a historical fact. I don't want to go into the brutality of what's happened to African Americans, if you wish, the torturing of African Americans during the Jim Crow law, nevertheless during slavery itself, with body parts being sold after the lynchings for nickels and dimes, etc. And as a result of the history of what's the interactions between African Americans and the criminal justice system, what we argue and what's been documented is that the criminal justice system has created a reservoir of bad will, or what Tyler refers to as a sea of hostility among African Americans, principally because of the racist practices by the criminal justice system towards the racial subordination of African Americans. And we hypothesize that African Americans that perceive criminal justice injustices, in Tyler's terms, the violations of procedural justice, are less likely to believe in the legitimacy of the law and are therefore more likely to offend. Why should I obey a law that I believe has no legitimacy? And these individuals, we argue, are likely to respond to this deep feeling of injustice with defiance and anger. So we're kind of building on Sherman's work for those who are familiar with it. Another key theoretician that informs why people offend is, of course, Hershey. And I'm going to have some choice words to say about Hershey right now. He offers a race-neutral theory. So it doesn't make any difference whether you're black or white. The reason why 6% commits 60% has nothing to do with the racial subordination of African Americans. They simply are failing to bond. And one of the key bonds that has to happen in order for people to not offend is that they have to believe in authority, accept the legitimacy of the law. So the more you accept the legitimacy of the law, the less likely you are to offend. So then the question then becomes, well, why do African Americans disproportionately commit these offenses according to Hershey? And he features the concept of belief in the law. So then he argues, well, why, the only argument that's consistent, at least in my interpretation of control theory, for why African Americans are disproportionately offending is that their parents, and listen closely here, their parents are failing to teach their children to respect the law. And somehow or another, if the parents did a better job of teaching their kids to respect the law, African American offending would no longer be disproportionate. And so the data that he uses to support this argument is he found that people who strongly disagreed with the statement, "I have a lot of respect for the Richmond police," were 4 times more likely to self-report 2 or more delinquent acts than those who strongly respected the Richmond police. Please don't forget that he was writing in 1968 in Berkeley, California, and all he had to do was look out his window and see half of California on fire because of the racial riots. But somehow or another, this guy miraculously doesn't see that as relating to the offending among African Americans. So we agree that early family socialization experiences predict why some African Americans weakly believe in the law. So we agree with her to a point. We also agree that lack of respect for the police is related to African American offending. His data show it. The paper I won that award for, I reanalyzed those data, and in fact, I replicated that finding. However, we take, and I'm going to go ahead and ad-lib, serious issue with control theory's assumption that early family socialization experiences are the only reason, and I italicize that on purpose, why some blacks weakly support the law. Rather, we hypothesize that a chief reason why some African Americans are weakly bonded to the law is because they perceive the criminal justice system as a racist institution. So what does this mean? The only way that I could make this simple is to say it's similar to asking a person who's being abused to bond with the abuser. That is, so if I'm getting mistreated by the criminal justice system, you want me to do what? You want me to respect the police? And the only reason I don't respect the police is because my parents didn't teach that when they're beating me over the head? To me, it's incredulous that somehow or another, this concept of what we're presenting in this book has been ignored by every single white theoretician that is principally responsible for creating all the general theories of criminology.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Jim.
Okay. So one of the other difficulties that we had that we're confronted with is not only are we explaining why blacks disproportionately offend, but like Shaun said, the vast majority of African Americans do not offend. So now we're in a position of having to explain the disproportionality, but at the same time acknowledging and explaining why the vast majority do not offend. And as far as I know, no other theoretician has looked at these rather complex issues. This has been essentially ignored by the entire field of criminology. And then we're in an equally complex problem because we're arguing that nearly every African American is raised within this sea of hostility or share the same worldview, that race and racism matter. The one thing that is central to this worldview that we argue that defines what it is to be an African American in a racist society is that they know that their race matters. And they also know that they're going to, in all likelihood, at some point in their life, encounter white racists and be discriminated against. So if that's a universally shared worldview, then it would only make sense, for example, that black women who also share that worldview would offend at the same rate as black men. That simply isn't the case. So then we argue that one of the reasons why there's intravariation within African Americans is the degree to which they experience racial discrimination or racial injustices. So what we argue is that one of the core measures to explain African American offending is to essentially measure this concept of perceptions of racial injustice. And so then we argue, well, what kind of measures are going to be needed to accurately assess the degree of this perception? So we argue that the perception of racial injustice should be measured nearly the same way that people measure child abuse. So what kind of measures are used to measure child abuse? Age of onset. At what point do African Americans first experience an instance of racial discrimination? Is it at 4 years of age? Is it at 5 years of age? At what age were they being abused, if you wish? And we need to measure that. Then the next question is, well, what is the frequency? How often has this racial discrimination happened in this person's life? Then the chronicity. How severe is that abuse, if you wish? How severe is their experiences with racial discrimination. What, if you wish, what's the level of humiliation that accompanies that racial discrimination? And then another measure that's always used in the child abuse literature is the duration. How long has that continued in that person's life? Obviously, and Dubose says if it's a one-time deal, that's going to be a whole lot different than if at 4 years of age, the police were beating your parents in front of you, right? And then you went to get jobs, and every time you turned around, you were being discriminated against, et cetera, and that's sustained across your life. Then what we're arguing that if people are continually experiencing this, then the likelihood, that is the within variation among African Americans, those that are encountering the greatest degree of racial subordination are the ones that are most likely to offend. And then finally, in the child abuse literature, does it make a difference if your father is the one that's raping you versus someone that's a stranger, for example? So who is the person that is perpetrating these racial injustices? Is it somebody that's in a position of trust like a parent? Is it a police officer that's the one that you're supposed to look up to as Hershey was demanding African Americans to do while they were getting beat over the head? Well, wait a second, who is the one that's doing this? Is it a person of trust? And whether or not that will make an impact in terms of how it resonates within the body, if you wish, of feeling these racial injustices. And then finally, we argue that if a person's embedded in a network if they're, if you wish, more deeply embedded in this sea of hostility, then that's going to enhance their probability of perceiving these racial injustices and in all likelihood reacting to these racial injustices with a great deal of anger and some people even argue rage. So we also argue that this intra-variation among African American offending can be related to variations in place. So we're going to give a little credence to social disorder right now, though we'll have more to say about social disorder later. So how does place matter? Well, at this point, we're going to argue that there are pockets of legal cynicism. And that if African Americans are embedded in these pockets of legal cynicism, that increases the likelihood that they will encounter injustices. And we respond to them with anger and defiance. So as we all know, what neighborhoods are the ones that are most policed? Let me guess, poor black areas. So if you were living in this poor black area, maybe that you'll have a slightly higher chance of encountering racial injustices and then vicariously having that resonate through that community, like the hurricanes that have come through. I live in Florida or even up here in Huntsville, if I'm not mistaken. And so then what I mentioned before is that there's a tremendous gap within African Americans between male and female offending. And this has been one of the more brain-twisting analysis for us that really pushed us. And why don't black women offend if they are as deeply embedded in the worldview, and if they're encountering the same levels of racial discrimination, or nearly the same, then what's happening here? Well, the reality is that they don't encounter the same levels of racial injustice. And guess which one they're least likely to be equal to in terms of men? It is, of course, criminal justice injustices. It is particularly problematic for African American men. So then we expand our analysis, if you wish. If, in some ways you could argue it's almost our operationalization of what racial subordination means, to include not only criminal justice injustices in the Sherman literature, but we also argue that there is racial discrimination that's unrelated to the criminal justice system. And then there's negative stereotypes, stereotype threats, and all these are compelling forces that are related to African American offending. So why should racial discrimination be related to African American offending? It's actually, I'm going to probably use this word quite often today, it's relatively incredulous to me that there is a ton of research, endless articles in the medical journals showing that racial discrimination negatively impacts the well-being of African Americans, increasing heart attacks, increasing mental health problems, hypertension, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't even know how to communicate this to you, but there is basically, and it's only been in the last couple of years, and you know how long criminology's been around, that there's been any research in the field of criminology that I am aware of that's looked at whether racial discrimination is a predictor of offending. And if if nothing else, I could give you the homework to try to figure out why that is the case. How is that possible when what makes being black in America is their encounters with racial discrimination? Why isn't that featured in the general theories that we're all brought up to believe in as the holy grail of criminology? Why isn't that one of the most featured variables in these? I can think of only 4 or 5 articles in the entirety of the canon of criminology that's looked at that issue. So we argue, and we have probably 100 different hypotheses in our book, but certainly, as Will said, this is one that could be tested and is being tested principally by the group with Ron Simon. We hypothesize that racial discrimination causes some African Americans to experience anger, hostility, and hopelessness, which in turn enhances their probability of offending. We hypothesize it's not only just the fact that when you're insulted by somebody, by being discriminated against about something that you have absolutely no control over, i.e. your skin color, that in and of itself is going to generate a great deal of animosity. And as we all know, we all act in ways in which we regret when we're most angry. There is, every time that I've gotten really angry and I've said something, there's no way to get it back, right? But, we do that. But, we're, as whites, not confronted with a system that is continually causing us to have a great deal of anger. But we also argue that it's a little bit more complex than just having angry people ready to fly off the handle. We also hypothesize that racial discrimination is related to offending because it undermines the ability of blacks to bond with white-dominated, in Hershey's terms, conventional institutions. And so we spent a great deal of time in the book looking at the key institution that I think everybody in this room would argue is related to offending, and that's the institution of education. And so then the question is, well, are African Americans equally bonded to the institution of education as whites are? And if there is a discrepancy, what can account for that if you believe that if you're bonded to this institution, you're less likely to offend? Well, the data are unequivocal, and they show that African Americans perceive that schools discriminate against them. And that could be in the aggregate. I don't think there's anybody in here that would disagree with the fact that if you're going to a $20,000 all-white private school, that's quite different than if you're in a school located in the worst area of Houston, Texas. So we all know that some schools are a whole lot better, and I don't think anybody in here would disagree with the fact. The fact is that the schools that are most highly valued, disproportionately, if you wish, do not include African Americans in their student body. You don't think blacks know that? Look at Chris Rock. His parents got him out of a black school and brought him to an all-white school almost. Why? Because his parents knew that he'd get a better education. So we hypothesize that perceived racial discrimination within schools undermines the ability of blacks to bond with that institution. We further hypothesize that the African Americans who are most likely to offend are those that have the weakest bonds with their schools because they receive discriminatory treatment. So once again, we're all about Hershey here, but we're not blaming parents for inadequately socializing their children. It's the same thing as with the criminal justice system. Is it possible to bond with an institution that is purposely, in their eyes, discriminating against you? And the answer is it becomes problematic. It doesn't mean that all blacks are going to reject the school system, but it does say that it's making it more problematic for them. We also argue that as part of this racial subordination is the fact that white people pejoratively depict African Americans. And we go in great detail in the book explaining how these stereotypes have originated with our founding fathers. And I don't want to go into great detail, but Thomas Jefferson is one of the people that have had a long list of very derogatory stereotypes of African Americans. And I don't want to, it's almost too disgusting for me to tell you what those stereotypes are. But here we have our founding fathers, many of whom were slave owners, perpetrating these negative stereotypes of African Americans. And what Thomas Jefferson was saying close to 300 years ago are nearly identically ranked in the recent research in terms of how white people think about black people. So, but what is one of the more dominating stereotypes that whites have about African Americans? And that is, and this is a gendered stereotype, that the vast majority, I wouldn't say that, but a considerable number of white people perceive African Americans, particularly African American men, as prone to violence. What the word that we use in the criminological literature is the criminal black man, the super predator. So how do these stereotypes that are pervasive, and I'll tell you later, I'll preempt myself, by age 10, nearly every African American is fully aware of the stereotypes that whites have of them. So it's not like they're not fully knowledgeable how we as whites are depicting them. And once again, are we supposed to say that our attitudes towards blacks have no impact on them? Incredulous to me. So we hypothesize that some blacks internalize the stereotype that they're criminal. If you think I'm that way, you know what? I'll cash it in. I'll do exactly what you think I am. You think I'm criminal, I'll start to act like a criminal. That is, which is for you guys, this is a 1960s theory, but labeling theory, right? That's the basis of labeling theory. But we also argue, and here's another backdoor critique of Hershey, Gofferson and Hershey, we assert that negative stereotypes also deplete the emotional resources African Americans. How would you like to live in a world where you're constantly being dissed? How would you like to live in a world where you're constantly thought of less than? So that you're constantly having to deal with these, this weight on your shoulders. And there's all sorts of research, John Henryism, I don't have time, this is a Reader's Digest version of our book, that when people feel exhausted, in the treatment literature, NIH, there's this word halt. When you're hungry, angry, lonely, tired, I don't know if anybody's ever heard that, that's when you're most likely to start to do things that you wish you didn't do. So what we're arguing is that if you're constantly having to deal with the weight of feeling that you're less than, that after a while that weight just becomes an incredible burden and it depletes your emotional resources. And what happens when your emotional resources are depleted? That's when you start to act out. That's when you start to get angry. So that low self-control, we agree once again with Gofferson and Hershey. Sure, it comes from your parenting, but can it also come from other external sources where you're constantly being bombarded and eventually you just lose it? And that's what we argue is another consequence of racial subordination. So then finally, we also argue that toxic stereotypes cause some African Americans to experience heightened states of hopelessness, depression, and anger rage, which are related to higher rates of offending. As I mentioned, by age 10, all this is just common sense for African Americans. Us whites may not even perceive this, but by 10 they all know, and it's called stereotype consciousness, or another word that they use in the literature is stigma consciousness. And actually most people argue by the age 6 or 8, African Americans are fully aware of how us whites think about them. So then I'm going to introduce this concept that I haven't seen in the criminological literature, and it's introduced by Claude Steele, who's the provost at Columbia University right now. And this is a groundbreaking study, and it's called Stereotype Threats. I don't know if anybody knows the stereotype threat. Anybody know that literature by chance? Well, good. I'm glad you hear that. Steele went about trying to explain the gap between blacks and whites on standardized tests. And what he ended up finding out is that blacks underperform on these tests when they perceive that the tests are related to one of the negative stereotypes that depict them. And maybe I'll just generalize this so that maybe I'll bring more of you into this. This is also true for women, and this research is unequivocal. There isn't any data that doesn't support it. That is that why do women not score well on math tests? Are you innately inferior to us men? Well, the answer is that when you are taking a test and you are taking a math test, you get more anxious because you're afraid that if I don't do well on this, guess what? Everybody's going to start to think that I'm not that smart. And so doubt creeps in, anxiety creeps in. And I don't know about you, but when I'm doubtful and I have a great deal of anxiety, it's hard for me to concentrate. And you're asking me to fill in all these bubble tests in the middle of me feeling all this anxiety. And this is what's called stereotype threats. And once again, this research is nearly, as far as I know, unequivocal in terms of its impact on people's ability to perform. So then what Steele argues is that African Americans, as Waiting for Superman would show, they want to do well in school. So they come into the schools and they're all enthusiastic, no different than white people. And then they end up starting to take these tests, and they know that the people in that classroom are thinking like Thomas Jefferson did, that they have low intelligence. Right? And they think that the teacher thinks of them as having low intelligence. And guess what they end up doing? They end up self-defeating themselves, not intentionally, not even necessarily consciously, but they start underperforming on these tests. And then what Steele says is that because of this emotional investment in their education that doesn't get proven by the data that they start to do well, well, what do? It's like having a girlfriend that drops you. How often do you keep going back? Sure, you'll go back one time and say, oh, please take me back. But if she's basically cheating on you, are you going to continue to go back? Right? Well, the answer is no. Because who wants to continually try to do something that you fail at? So then what happens, according to Steele, is that they emotionally withdraw themselves. They become, what in his language, they become disidentified. No one wants to try. It's hard to sustain an emotional attachment to something that you fail at. And so then I'm going to give Hershey credit and Gofferson. They say that one of the things about crime is it's not very complex, that if you wish, any idiot can commit crime. Well, then what happens to these disidentified youth is because they're not getting any emotional reward from their school, that bond, and because they perceive it as discriminatory, they weaken their bonds, and they start to emotionally withdraw from the school, and guess who they end up hanging around with? Other emotionally disidentified youth. And so here we are in learning theory. If you hang around with other disidentified youth, then is that going to enhance your probability of offending? At least then they could do something that they are getting some credit for and doing it in their estimation relatively well. So we hypothesize that stereotype threats undermine the ability of African Americans to develop strong attachments to their education, which increase their probability of offending. So the blue is a new chapter. And so now we're going to introduce another concept that many of you may not be familiar with, and that is the concept of racial socialization. And our theory incorporates the fact that a majority of African Americans believe that the way in which they raise their children is related to their offending. The actual data was one of my articles. 55% of African Americans believe that the way in which they raise their children has something to do with their offending. I.e., it'd be, that's common sense to me. So how do we incorporate their own belief about the African American family having something to do with their own children offending? So we, in our book, feature this concept of racial socialization. And we hypothesize, another testable hypotheses for you graduate students, that a key reason why some blacks offend is the degree to which, once again, degree to which they have been positively racially socialized. What is racial socialization? This is a rather long quote, but specific verbal and nonverbal messages transmitted to younger generations for the development of values, attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs regarding the meaning, significance of race and racial stratification, intergroup and intragroup interactions, and personal and group identity. That is, how do black parents teach their kid how to live in a society where you're not valued? Well, what do you do with that? What's the transmission there? So scholars argue that African American parents must racially socialize their children so they understand African American culture and how to interact with other blacks, how to get along with other racial ethnic groups, which we will feature later. Guess who they need to get along with? The group that has power. And who is that group? Whites. And how to cope with their minority status. And so what does the research show is that nearly all, 2 out of 3 African American families engage in some aspect of racial socialization. And researchers have identified 4 components of what constitutes racial socialization. Cultural socialization, racial pride, preparation for bias. Look at, you're going to encounter people thinking of you as less. You're going to encounter job discrimination. You may encounter it in the school. What do you do when you encounter this? I.e., do they instill with them skills to cope with living in a society that's racist? And then another one is promotion of mistrust, which we'll talk about later, and then egalitarian values. So we basically assume that positive racial socialization experiences create a stronger racial identity, which allows African Americans to more effectively fend off the toxic consequences of their racial subordination, like water off the back of a duck. So how do they, we feature the African American family, but we also believe that there are other socialization agents that are responsible for communicating a positive racial identity. And one of those, as we all know, historically has been the black church. Now, these next kinds of statements are more specific hypotheses. So we essentially are hypothesizing that African Americans are more likely to offend if their parents inadvertently fail to fully prepare them to fend off the toxic effects of racial injustice. These children are left to construct their racial identity on the streets. So remember that 2 out of 3 racially socialize their children, which means that 1 out of 3 essentially provides no help on how to negotiate being black in a racially stratified society. And we say that those kids are particularly vulnerable to being one of the ones that are included in our official statistics, because they end up creating their racial identity from interacting on the streets, which probably means they're interacting with other emotionally disidentified youth. We further hypothesize that African Americans are more likely to offend if their parents racially socialize them to be vigilantly distrustful of whites. This distrust of whites undermines the ability of blacks to build strong ties with white-dominated institutions. Now, we feature racial socialization, and we argue that that's a key variable in terms of predicting which African Americans offend. But we also say that race, place, and race are related. So we say that ghettos were purposely constructed by racist whites to subordinate, isolate, and limit the life chances of African Americans. And that African Americans do not want to live in ghettos. In fact, most African Americans would rather live in a race-mixed neighborhood. However, over 70% of African American children raised in a socially disorganized neighborhood will continue to live there, cross-generation. So social disorganization tests their theory by looking at different communities, but there is no community, there is no white community in the United States with this stat. There's no comparable data. So our theory recognizes that place matters, but argues that it's not deterministic. The majority of African Americans, wherever they live, do not engage in crime. In fact, the aggregate stats that basically are used to measure social disorder at best don't explain 10% of individual offending. regardless of where you live, you still choose to engage in crime. So we argue that place matters. What matters in terms of informing that choice is that it matters because it increases the probability that African Americans will experience racial injustices, criminal justice injustices, racial discrimination, pejorative stereotypes, and stereotype threats. In fact, we argue that the concept of ghetto is a stereotype threat. So then we also argue, and this is our, if you wish, how we would add to social disorder, that place matters because it alters the ability to parents to effectively racially socialize their children. So how does that happen? Well, we argue that if you live in one of these isolated, hyper-segregated, extremely poor areas, that it increases the likelihood that parents will not racially socialize their children, leaving them to create a racial identity interacting with other disidentified youth. They increase the likelihood that parents will racially socialize their children to be mistrustful of whites, minimize their cultural socialization, and inadequately prepare them for encounters with racial injustice. They also decrease the likelihood that children will see their parents positively interacting with whites. If the entire neighborhood is African American, and a key for getting along in white-dominated institutions is to be trustful of whites, exactly how does that occur? They disproportionately expose parents to the stressors associated with their racial subordination, depleting their emotional resources, rendering them less effective. Could you only imagine living in one of these ghettos? So social exclusion heightens the likelihood of engaging in conspicuous consumption. This is actually out of the consumer marketing research. Marginalized African Americans assuage their feelings of exclusion and being less than by buying status-related items. So whites always look at these young African Americans living in these hyper-segregated neighborhoods with all this gold, and we're going, why are they buying that? What's up with that? This is the reason as far as we're concerned. Now, what about racial socialization and gender? So we argue that there are toxic gendered stereotypes, and stereotypes threats impact black male offending more so than African American females. They undermine the ability of black men to strongly bond to white-dominated institutions. So you see two black men walking down the sidewalk and you're white, do you react the same if you see two black females? The answer is probably not, because we all have gender stereotypes that are particularly targeting black men. So gender differences of offending are related to gender disparities in the degree which African American males and females encounter criminal justices and racial injustices. African American parents are more likely to socialize their daughters with a greater sense of racial pride and egalitarian values than their sons. African American females attend the black church more often than African American men, a positive racial socialization experience. African American parents better prepare their daughters than their sons for their encounters with racial discrimination. And in part of that preparation is how to cope with racism. Black men, according to the literature, are more likely to use an avoidance coping style, which is the worst. If you wish, they swallow the humiliation. Whereas black women seek out social support. They talk to their girlfriends. They talk to their parents. What do black men do with it? And the other thing that's critical is black women have the ability to confront the perpetrator of the racial injustice. Where if black men do, then they're just going to reconfirm the stereotype of what? The angry, young, black male. So they sit there, and it sits, and it sits. So finally, I got two more slides. What else can explain this within variation among African Americans? Well, one of the inabilities that most whites have is to recognize that there are tremendous ethnic differences among African Americans. In fact, the literature shows that one of the most model minorities, not Asians, is what my co-author is, an Afro-Caribbean. So that we argue that these ethnic differences among African Americans has a lot to do with the variation among blacks in their offending. And so why do, I taught a lot of Ethiopians their parents didn't want them to hang around with American blacks. So why is it that foreign-born blacks have less rates of offending, and I'm going to go ahead and tell you this, less rates of offending than do whites? Why is that? And the core reason, which is the basic assumption of our book, is that foreign-born blacks, whether they're from Africa or whether they're from the Caribbean islands, don't buy into or share the same worldview as do American-born blacks. And because they don't buy into it, they're less likely to have the same feelings that race and racism matter in our deterministic forces in their lives. So then, however, we argue that subsequent generations of foreign-born blacks may increase in their offending, and this is a big if they more closely adopt the worldview shared by US-born blacks. Finally, what is another reason for the within variation among African Americans? And this is just very recent research, and it's called colorism. Does the tone of skin matter? Would Obama have been elected if he was darker than he is, for example? It's a critical question. So what is colorism? It's the racialized color consciousness hierarchies, and that's within the black community, high yellow, also in terms of how whites respond to African Americans. So what do we hypothesize? We hypothesize that darker skinned African Americans are more likely to encounter criminal justice injustices, racial injustices, less likely to be hired, and react negatively, more negatively to stereotypes and to stereotypes threats. Thus, we predict that darker skinned blacks should have higher rates of offending than their lighter skinned counterparts. And here's our schematic, our flow diagram of our theory. And I kind of went over this, so I'm not going to, but like Shaun said, notice that the key is that it's a unique share. If you don't buy into this, then you don't buy our theory. The bottom line is if you don't accept that, then anything else in the theory doesn't make sense. So as you can see, the unique worldview influences perceptions. Perceptions influence the unique worldview. Everything goes through racial socialization. These two dotted lines is that if they're overwhelmed, there is a possibility for a direct effect. But racial socialization undermines negative emotions, the ability to build strong bonds, and African American offending goes back and reinforces the worldview. So that's it. Questions and answers.
Put the last slide up, so this I'm sure. Thank you very much.
How to do it? You just couldn't do it out of her. You couldn't do it out the sunshine.
Let me ask the first question here. First of all, I want to applaud you for challenging the contemporary social control of criminological theory, because I think theory tends to force us to look at certain areas, and you guys have basically thumped the head of traditional criminological theories. But I don't want to get caught into this academic realm of theory, because I think this actually has some great policy implications. Let me ask you, could you speak to the policy implications that come from such a theory, and what does that really mean given the geographic context within which we live in America?
Well, I mean, I think anytime you have a theory that hasn't been tested, you're always kind of hesitant to come out and give policy implications. But certainly our theory, we drew on the extant literature that's out there, and there's been a bunch of research in other disciplines on racial socialization. There are actually validated scales, things like that you can actually measure these things to possibly see if they are valid. And from that, if we do that, then you can actually come up with some policies. But I mean, we debated about whether to include a policy chapter. I mean, we talked about, everybody's gonna talk about policy, but how do you create a theory that's untested and have policy implications? You just don't do that. So, I mean, that's kind of where we are. There is some literature in other areas where you may be able to see things that are relevant, but we don't want to do that until we have direct tests of the theory.
No, I just want to add, Howard, that he picked us up at the airport and we had this kind of conversation, and he's into corrections, and I asked him, well, do you think that the treatment centers, rehab, halfway houses, should they be race-based? Do African American women encounter different issues in terms of their likelihood of recidivating as do white women. And so that I would believe that there are issues that African American women may encounter that even though they may share a great deal, but there are, white women aren't encountering racial discrimination, for example. And so that until we get to the point where we as a society could accept, like we have, hopefully we will in criminology as a science, accept the idea that we need to integrate race as part of our understanding of why people offend, then if we accept that, then it would seem to me that we would have to accept it in terms of our policy implications. But I don't know if we as a nation are at that point yet, to be honest with you. Because as soon as we bring up the issue of race, as our Attorney General, our new Black Attorney General said, it becomes a divisive issue. So I don't know if we're quite ready there despite the election of a Black president.
Hi, I'm a professor in the history department, and I discuss these issues all the time in my upper level classes on race, African American history, history of the Black Civil Rights Movement. And I believe part of the challenge is encouraging Americans to understand that there is a historical connotation associated with contemporary problems and challenges, these issues we're discussing now. And until we understand that history, there is a reason for why Afro-Caribbeans, West Africans, East Africans, as immigrants come here and thrive. Most people don't realize this, but they are actually the number one immigrant group when it comes to education. They're the most educated immigrant group in the United States. They are 50% of all Black college students. 50% of all Black college students in the United States today are either immigrants or the children of immigrants. But I make the argument always that all of this is related to slavery. And until we understand that legacy, we will continue to reap these regrettable benefits, unfortunately. And also, I think historians and sociologists have been focusing on these issues. I'm thinking of Dr. Du Bois in the Philadelphia Negro in 1895, one of the founders of American sociology. He pointed out that criminology is more so associated with African Americans, particularly Southern African Americans who immigrated into Philadelphia, mainly because of these issues. He also talked about the idea of a double consciousness, that being Black in America means that you define yourself by what others see you as, by the way others perceive you every single day. So again, my concern is that particularly our younger generation, that because it is deemed negative to discuss these issues, it is deemed anti-white to discuss these issues, that we really never deal with the heart of the matter.
Right.
Yeah.
Never give the
but
mic to
maybe
a
to
professor. Questions? Come this way.
First, I really enjoyed your talk, and I appreciate the fact of, like Howard mentioned, you guys addressing, an inherently tough issue head on. So I can very much appreciate that. My question is a bit more aimed at theory. You bring out the finding in emerging, especially recently in crim research, of almost an offender typology, 6% accounting for a disproportionate number of crimes. Terry Moffat addresses that issue head on and specifies different mechanisms for those who offend chronically and those who offend primarily in adolescence, the vast majority of the population. Could you speak to that? How does that dovetail with your work, and do you think it has application in what you guys are addressing?
What's that, the adolescent limited?
Her research is unequivocal, for one thing. There's been considerable amount of research that disputes the idea that there's dual trajectories. Most of the people that are in prison have drug and alcohol related problems. I was talking to Howard, I forget it was a 7-to-1 ratio of African Americans in prison, I believe. and to argue that it's all because of what happened to them in the first 4 years of their life is the same thing as my critique of Hershey. I just find that incredulous. I don't even know how to respond to that in some ways, because what you're ignoring is what it means to be black in a society that is racially stratified. And I don't see that in Moffat's work. So that, once again, if you're asking blacks to bond to white-dominated institutions that historically and currently devalue them as a person because of their skin color. And until that's resolved, if you want a policy statement, until that's resolved, we're going to have incredibly high rates of African American offending. And that is going beyond, we feature the family, but we also argue that there's so much more to what's going on that is outside of the control of the family that happens to African Americans. So, is she right? Maybe. Is she right about featuring what happens to people early on in their lives? Absolutely. Is she flat out wrong because she totally ignores what it means to live in a conflicted, racially stratified society? In our estimation, absolutely. Does she acknowledge that there is a worldview that is unique and peerless that only African Americans share? Yes, and until these general theories acknowledge what we believe is the fundamental truth, then I believe that they are going to never fully understand what is the most glaring statistic in all of criminology.
Yes, my question is two in one. I'm just going to do it like that. I want to know, could this ever end? And if you feel that it could end, how would we have to start it?
Could it ever end? Well, we'd have to have a massive change in the way we think in our society. People make note of the demographic shifts in the country, and that could potentially be a way that some of the thinking might change, because as the country becomes a little more diverse, we're going to see that we're going to have more minorities in positions of power and things like that, and that could change. I mean, population demographics are very important in terms of swaying the way things are done to some extent. What was the second part of that? How? Well, obviously, if you have a minority population that's growing and has more influence in what goes on, we could possibly see some changes in terms of policies. But I mean, whether that happens or not is another thing. I think only time will tell whether these changes happen with the changing demographics in the country.
Now, this is like old times. I wasn't going to let you off the hook. And remember, you taught me.
This is not like old times.
One of the things that you taught me was always to look at what's left out of an argument, what's left out of a journal article. And one of the things that's nowhere mentioned in here is the Moynihan report. Within that, sociologist, Dr. Moynihan, concluded that the steady expansion of welfare programs can be taken as a measure of steady disintegration of the African American family. That was written in 1965, and we know the welfare state has grown. The dissolution of the African American family, you place the African American family as an important, almost an inoculation against the racism, the prejudice that African Americans are going to face. But just some quick statistics. In 1960, 28% of black females, 15 to 44, were never married. Today it's almost 60%. 1940, the illegitimacy rate was 22%. Today it's 70%. Early 20th century, 75% of children live with both parents. Today that's 35%. So the book mentions the importance of parents preparing their children for the racism that they will face, but how do you address that in terms of the dissolution of the American family and the rise of the welfare state today?
You want that one?
He took a long time to prepare that question. It's a great question, Will. I think that whenever you talk about welfare, it leads into the argument of the intergenerational transmission of values. And our theory assumes that there is a worldview that nearly all African Americans share. And I think somewhat cleverly argue that it is both a source of offending, but it is also the reason why the vast majority of African Americans do not offend. And in the Moynihan report, you do not have anything about the resiliency of the African American family. So how does the African American family actually, or how does this worldview diminish the likelihood of offending? So we don't argue that it's an intergenerational transmission. So, but we do argue that the worldview it provides the resiliency for blacks to overcome what's happened to them. The vast, vast majority of blacks aren't in our prisons. Well, why is that? Because that worldview is providing them with the ability to cope with what's happening to them. Now, we do feature the African American family, but we don't center on whether it's female-headed or not.
Yeah.
But the data actually show that female-headed households and African Americans with less education are less likely to racially socialize their children. So that is part of our theory. And so, but we also argue though, and what I think that anytime you get into this intergenerational transmission, whether it's across welfare or a culture of poverty argument, that don't forget also that the African American family itself is being bombarded by the racial subordination. So those numbers to me are the outcome of the book we just wrote. So that when you're looking at 70% of black families who live below the poverty line, or 70% of the children who live below poverty that are African American are living in a single parent household, well, I would suggest that if you want to understand why that's happening is read our book. And so that one of the things that we argue is that is simply what the end product of what we have created. And not only that, but the other thing that I want to emphasize that I may not have been the lecture itself is that if you live in one of these poor, hyper-segregated, isolated neighborhoods, you also don't have the advantages for pro-socialization. How many chances do you have to interact positively with whites? Because we purposely segregate blacks, we isolate them, and then whites don't even want to go anywhere near those neighborhoods because they're afraid of going into those neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. But the key is in part to be able to racially socialize your children and see them interacting positively with whites, and that's something that's not going to happen. Is that a failure of the family? Is that a failure of our society? Or are we reaping the exact thing that we purposely created? And finally, the other thing that I would add to that is, the inadequate socialization, racial socialization, is in part related to the stress load that the black family is experiencing. I can't imagine what it is, Will, to be living in this ghetto, in this hyper-segregated neighborhood, feeling that you are stereotyped simply because you live there, and then having to deal with that on a day-to-day basis. And once again, is that emotionally exhausting? And when are parents bad parents, if you wish? When they're most emotionally overwhelmed, right? When you go home and you've been working hard and you're tired and you're exhausted, are you going to tell me that you're a better parent in those moments? And I would say that is essentially what is the lived experiences of what it means to be an African American family living in the very areas that we purposely have created for them. You want to add anything?
I think you said it all, Jim.
Good morning. From a theoretical perspective, you talk about the work of Du Bois and what he has done with the lived experiences. And I think of the work of another sociologist, Elijah Anderson, and his work on Code of the Streets. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how his work on Code of the Streets has maybe informed yours, is related to or similar to yours, or maybe be integrated into the work that you've done at this point.
Well, we do talk about the streets and how if the parents don't racially socialize African Americans, the streets will. But one of the things we like Anderson's work to a certain extent, but we don't really think he gives enough credence to sort of where did this come from? Okay, he sort of just talks about the code of the streets. And if you really think about his arguments, it's almost a labeling perspective. He says, well, you're either street or you're decent. He doesn't necessarily talk enough about racial subordination to some extent. So we don't really feature him in our book. I mean, in fact, we have him where? As a footnote?
I got it in a footnote.
No, you know, and not to say there's some validity to what he's arguing, but I think really he doesn't capture the full essence of what's going on, okay? And it needs to be expanded, and that's essentially what we've tried to do, expand on some of what people have been saying, because most of what we do is integrate some of other theorists.
I want to comment on it. One of the most interesting research I read for the book was on this concept of insult. Mm-hmm. You know, and it actually goes back historically to the slap across the face and how wars have been fought over, you know, and supposedly here in the South, some
disrespect.
You know, the Southern culture violence argument that some insult and these two white guys walk 10 feet from one another and turn around and shoot each other, right? So, you know, if I feel insulted, and in my estimation, I think it's a basic premise of our book, is to live in the United States and be black, though not universally, is an insult. You're being insulted. And so then, if you're continually in a position of being insulted, and there's absolutely nothing you can do to stop that personally, except when the immediacy when someone's perpetrating a racist act against you specifically. So then, and then you are, for whatever reason, economically in a desperate situation, homeless or whatever it may be, and someone insults you. They, you know, make a slight, and they say something with the N-word or whatever. You know, does that surprise you? And is this macho, this diss thing? As I said to Will last night, this code of the streets, just like what we were talking about before, is the end product of this. It's not an independent variable, it's the dependent variable. When you insult people as a nation, and then you're going to have a heightened, vigilant sense of being insulted. And if you're angry about being insulted, just like these white guys, you know, slapping each other and shooting one another, I don't see the difference. Get rid of the insult, and the code of the streets goes away. So, am I a fan of Anderson? Do I think he is onto something? Not really. And do I believe that he could better explain that from a larger perspective, incorporating what it means to be insulted by a nation because of what's happened to you historically and what's happening to you right today, this very day? Yeah, I think he could do a much better job. And I hate to see all this research in I don't know how to say it, non-critically accepting that, because it does, as Shaun said, leave this impression that it's a black problem. And the reality is homeless white people have that whole sense of anything happening to them, they're going to get in fights. So I don't like it, to be honest with you. I don't know how to say it, but there's some good things about it, is the best way I could say it.
I'm actually going to piggyback off of Dr. Oliver's question here, and something I'm curious about that's been touched on intermittently throughout is, could you maybe elaborate a little more on what your theory says about the intersection between race and class? Whereas you've touched on the intersection between race and gender, but I'm curious as to what you all would say about that particular intersection.
Class.
Well, that's another good question. Are you Will's student by chance? You know, the only thing that I would say is, given the history of what we've done to African Americans, us whites, that at times, and certainly in criminology, our thesis is that race supersedes class. So it's not necessarily being poor, it's about being black. Now, if you're poor and black, then that's more problematic. But just interestingly, just to throw this out, we do have a paragraph or two on white collar crime. And so what do we argue? We'll give Hershey credit, Gopperson, that the #1 crime for white collar is embezzlement. But what we argue is that if you're working in a job where you're devalued and it's a racist place to work, the chances of you stealing increase, because you don't care. You're not bonded. Mm-hmm. And so we do have a class dimension in the book, and that's pretty much how we deal with it.
Okay, I'm going to call